Good evening, everybody. I'm Susan Goldberg. I'm the editor-in-chief of National Geographic.
And I'm John Mason. I teach African history and the history of photography at UVA, the University of Virginia.
And we are here tonight because in our April issue of National Geographic, we decided to devote the entire issue to the subject of race, kicking off a year-long series about race and diversity in America. And when we started to do that, I decided that for us to write about race, we needed to look into our own archives at National Geographic. And so I asked John Mason for a little bit of help. Why don't you tell them what you did?
Well, when Susan asked me, I knew exactly why she did, because if National Geographic was going to do a special issue on race, it knew that readers were going to ask National Geographic, well, what about your own history? That your pictures and your stories have done so much to shape the way that Americans, and frankly people all over the world, see black and brown people. You've got to look into your past. And I suppose I was a good person to do it. I've taught African history for 25 years. I've taught the history of photography for about 10 years. I'm really interested in the way that Africans have been represented, have been depicted in the Western media. And I'm writing about Life magazine, not quite a competitor with National Geographic, but also a magazine that told its stories through pictures.
Well, exactly. And so one of the things that was so important was for us to acknowledge that while there is so much of our 130-year-old history at National Geographic that we are so proud of, that we, have allowed, we took people around the world. We often were the first place that they saw outside of their own communities. And I hear that as the editor of National Geographic all the time, that people have that memory. And so it's so important that we are accurate and authentic in our depictions of people and places. And mostly, as I said, we're really proud of that history, but it seemed incredibly important in this age of transparency and reckoning to acknowledge that we had not always depicted racial matters in a way that we're very proud of now. Why don't you tell people what you saw in our archives?
It was an interesting process. I grew up in a pretty middle-class family. My parents subscribed to National Geographic magazine, so I grew up looking at National Geographic and being enchanted by the photography. I don't think I ever read a single word, but, but the photographs took me to places that I was likely never to go, I'd never seen before. And and I've always liked photography, but I think that National Geographic is a big reason why I fell in love with photography. And of course, the other thing about the magazine is that your parents never threw it away. I mean, there were stacks and stacks of National Geographic in my house. But I do have to say I was growing up as an African-American kid. And there were things in National Geographic that even when I was a teenager troubled me about the way that Africans were shown in the magazine. Africans were almost never shown in cities, and I knew there were cities in Africa. Africans were never shown in Western clothes, and I knew that there were African politicians and businessmen and doctors who wore Western clothes and interacted with a cosmopolitan world. Africans were exotic and primitive and usually rural, and I thought that maybe there was another side of the story. So even back then, I suspected it. I didn't really know it, but I certainly learned it later in life.
Well, so John took a deep dive into our archives, a very deep dive, and spent a lot of time looking back. And he came back to me, and we talked about what he found. And so I decided to write about it for readers. So I wrote this letter that I think is going to come up on this screen. Maybe next slide, please. There we go. So I wrote this letter: to rise above the racism of the past, we must acknowledge it. And I think perhaps I was a little bit naive. Maybe we were both a little bit naive about the level of reaction that this caused. It was a big, like, boom, National Geographic acknowledges it was racist. And you did a lot of media interviews about this.
Yeah, I really did. But she suckered me into this because Susan said the magic words to an historian. She said, "You'll have unrestricted access to our archive." And historians love that. And so, yes, I was excited to do this project. I really was, and I'm really happy to have participated. But when Susan was telling me about the special issue on race and telling me about the contributors, both the photographers and the writers, I thought, okay, all the attention is going to be on the actual content of the issue, on the stories that they did. But in fact, all the attention was on Susan's letter from the editor, and that's because of this truly iconic status that National Geographic has. People really care about your magazine. Like me, they know it from childhood. It's part of their lives, and when you're talking about it so openly and so searchingly, people wanted more of that. So I don't know how many interviews you did. I counted 23 that I did.
Yeah, I did a lot. One of the things that I think is so interesting is we're seeing a lot more newspapers and magazines looking back into their own archives. I think there's just a story out this weekend about the newspaper in Montgomery, Alabama, where the Lynching Museum has just opened, looking back into how they covered this subject of lynching and really finding some horrific things in their own archives. But let's look at a few of the things that we found in our archives. Let's not start with this one. Let's actually, can we go one more maybe? All right, so this is a picture of Winnie Mandela from 1977, and you compared two stories that we did about South Africa, one from 1962, one from 1977. Why don't you tell us what you saw?
Right, Susan asked me a couple of minutes ago, what did I find and was I surprised? And I wasn't surprised, in part because I've been reading National Geographic now as an adult for so long. And I have to say there's a lot of really good academic writing that looks at the way that National Geographic has depicted Africans, Latin Americans, and Asians. I think what you and I did was to bring this academic discussion out into the public. So one of the things that I was looking at was this 1962 story on South Africa. 1962 was an interesting year in South Africa. It was 2 years after the Sharpeville massacre. Some of you might have heard of the Sharpeville massacre. It was when South African police opened fire on peaceful demonstrators. They were engaged in peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience, and South African police opened fire on a crowd and killed 69 people. The South African government itself acknowledged that most people were shot in the back as they ran away. This was 1960. It really shocked the world. It shocked the world. And it was also a moment in South African history where people had already heard the name Nelson Mandela. You know, Nelson Mandela was already a famous man. The struggle against apartheid in South Africa was already ongoing. So 2 years later,
in 1962,
2 years later, you do this story in 1962, which is basically a travel piece, which completely ignores the struggle against apartheid, which shows Africans in it only as a sort of exotic background material, doesn't quote any Africans, doesn't acknowledge the struggle against apartheid, doesn't acknowledge the way that the wealth of the country is built on the back of African workers. And I suppose it was a surprise to encounter that in 1962 because that's late for the American media not to acknowledge the horror of apartheid. You know, when the Sharpeville massacre happened, it was on the front page of the New York Times. American banks and corporations had a moment of thinking about withdrawing from South Africa. There was international isolation already happening, and it wasn't reflected in National Geographic. And it did surprise me that National Geographic was a good 2 steps behind the rest of the American media.
Well, and actually what you told me about this story from 1962 is you said it's bizarre actually to consider what the editors, writers, and photographers had to consciously not see.
Yes,
So then fast forward 15 years, it's now 1977, the U.S. Civil Rights Movement has happened, and you're finding a different kind of story in National Geographic, and that's that one with Winnie Mandela.
Right, and there's change. There is change within National Geographic. The magazine in 1977 was not the magazine it was in 1962. National Geographic took a bit longer than we would have wanted to begin this change of opening its eyes, but by 1977 the change was well underway. And so in 1977 it was a much more balanced story, which did acknowledge the struggle against apartheid, did acknowledge the deprivation of African people in South Africa, the discrimination, the racial oppression, et cetera. Yeah.
And I was very relieved to hear that once we got through the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, really the coverage in National Geographic changed a lot.
Yeah, there are, I think, several reasons for the change in National Geographic, and part of it is there was a change of editorship, as you know. The family that had controlled the editorial position at National Geographic was no longer there, very conservative family. But also, National Geographic is responding to the civil rights movement. And so the status of African Americans in the United States is changing, so the way that people of African descent are seen overseas is changing as well.
But I just thought it was so important that we put a stake in the ground about this for readers and that we own up to some of the fairly awful things that had happened. I mean, I think you pointed out to me, John, that National Geographic started in 1888 at the height of colonialism. So the whole world was cast as the colonized and the colonizers. And this is a picture of some Australian Aboriginal people who I believe we unfortunately described as the lowest of intelligence among human beings. And you say that now, and this was in 1916 that was the description. But it's even hard to just say that out loud now.
It is. And you look at the photograph, and the photograph itself is not necessarily a photograph that is in any way a racist photograph.
No.
You don't necessarily see this as a demeaning photograph, as a photograph that shows somebody who is a natural inferior. It took the text that went along with this, which you just quoted, to send that message. But if you're primed now by the text to see this as an example of, what was it, the lowest form of human being?
The lowest intelligence among human beings.
If you're primed to see it that way, then you can see it that way, and it's the way we're responding to the image. It's not anything that's in the image itself. But yeah, there are lots of examples of that, aren't there? Of that kind of looking down.
Well, now this is an interesting image.
Yeah.
What did you find out about this?
It's another image that in and of itself, it's a beautiful photograph of a beautiful young woman. And in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with it. But when you get page after page after page of beautiful young brown-skinned women, some of whom are very, very scantily clothed, you realize that National Geographic is seeing these young women without ever being explicit about it, seeing them as sort of erotic objects that are there for your viewing. And this is something that National Geographic's readers, especially those who were teenage boys, knew very, very well. And I was interviewed by Australian radio, right? And so the interview was actually making jokes about that just before he brought me on. Yeah.
Well, I have to tell you, the other thing you learn as when you're the editor of National Geographic is not only do people tell you, your magazine is how I first saw other places beyond my community. My grandfather has every issue since 1888, either in the attic or the basement. The other thing that men of a certain age all tell you, and very quietly, is that National Geographic, because they think you never heard this before, National Geographic is where they saw their first female breasts. But they all tell you that. They all tell you that.
I mean, it's funny. It's funny and it's true.
Yes.
But it's also, racially coded, because they were always brown breast or black breast. They were never white breast.
That actually is true, and that is something that has come up a lot. I think we are certainly greatly more selective in showing partially nude people, and occasionally we show white breasts now too.
I missed that, by the way.
I can show you later.
Okay.
Now, John, we've got to get this back on track.
All right.
I think we're going to get in a little bit of trouble here. All right, so now this was a very interesting observation that you had made that had never even occurred to me before about this. Tell everybody what you noticed.
So what we have here are, we're somewhere in East Asia, Southeast Asia. I can't remember exactly where we are in Southeast Asia, but it is a group of Southeast Asians looking at the National Geographic photographer who's fiddling with his camera, right? And so what this photograph is showing us is sort of the curiosity that people without technology have for instruments of Western technology. And this was a very fancy camera. It's a Leica. It was the best camera you could get at the time. And so it was emblematic of a very high stage of Western technology. Once again, it's not just one picture, but this reoccurred time and time and time again with black and brown people, usually depicted as rural or primitive or not cosmopolitan and not technologically advanced, who are fascinated by some aspect of Western technology. So sometimes it's the camera, sometimes it's the watch, sometimes it's the automobile, but just time and time again, when I was looking through your archive, I was running into those pictures.
And what is the message, do you think, of this picture?
It's reinforcing a kind of hierarchy, right? So in a simple-minded way, we can think of people who lack technology as lacking other things, right? If they lack technology, then they lack civilization. If they lack technology, then maybe they lack the intellectual capacity to develop technology on their own. I mean, we don't see any of these things as historically contingent, right? We don't we don't force ourselves to think back 500 years ago when leading civilization was in the Middle East and in Asia and India, not in the West. And so it's reinforcing a hierarchy here, right? It's a technological hierarchy, it's an intellectual hierarchy, but it's also a color hierarchy. So it's not just one picture, but it's the repetition of this kind of image that eventually sends the message, even without any words underscoring it.
So if you were talking to your students at the University of Virginia, how would you sum up really what you found looking at our archives?
I think the first thing I'd say is that National Geographic wasn't out of step with American culture, right? So that when a National Geographic is born, it's born at a moment where scientific racism was the so-called, I have to wiggle my fingers here, so-called scientific racism was at its height. It was the racial common sense of most white Americans.
We have a story actually about the roots of scientific racism in this
very
particular issue.
Yeah. It was the common sense, and that racial hierarchy was very much part of the way that people saw the world. And I would say that National Geographic changes as American culture changes. I think a half step behind, maybe 2 steps behind sometimes, but it changes as culture changes. So one of the things I was saying to people about your special issue is it doesn't come out of nowhere. The magazine has been in a constant evolution, at least since the 1970s. And so this is not the beginning of something, it's actually the culmination of changes that have already happened at the magazine.
Well, and thank goodness for that. One of the great things about being a journalist and working at newspapers and magazines is they are living, breathing things, and they both reflect their times and they can be brave. And I think one of the things that I'm really proud of is when we decided to own this issue and own our past, it really tells people, hey, we don't do that anymore, and we're very conscious of the fact that we need a diverse staff to cover a very diverse world, and we need to make sure we've got a really, really diverse set of photographers and writers telling these stories. And I think that's sort of the thing that I am the most concerned about going forward.
Well, I'm glad to hear you say that in public before a couple hundred people, because the question is where does National Geographic go from here? So for most of your history, it has been Americans going out into the world and telling the stories of other people for them, right? So it's the Indiana Jones, great adventurer, photographer, writer, usually male, going out into the world, finding things, coming back, and telling other people's stories. So one question is, do other people get to tell their own stories in the future? And how does the way that National Geographic shows the world, how does it change from here?
I think one of the pictures I wish I could call up, and maybe the folks in the back can help. There's a wonderful picture out of Haiti that I think was the 3rd picture in this series. But we're there we go.
Yeah.
We're giving When we did this story in 2015 out of Haiti, we actually gave cameras to young Haitians and conducted sort of a photography workshop for them and asked them to go capture their own lives. And that is certainly nothing I think we would have done long ago. But more important even is we've got to find people who have great familiarity with the places that they're covering, either because they live there or have spent vast amounts of time there, so we don't fall into some of those pat cliches and easy answers of the past. I think that is the most important thing we can do. And the other most important thing, and then maybe we can take a couple of questions from the audience, is more than half of the contributors to this particular issue were people of color.
Yes.
And very diverse also in terms of gender. I think that's great, but when we're going to have a real victory is when we do the special science issue or the special, weather issue, and we still have more than half of the people being who are contributors being people of color.
It's exactly right. You don't want to confine writers of color or photographers of color to doing only race, right? They can also do cowboys in Montana.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, so maybe we could turn up the house lights and see if there's any questions out there. And I know there's a microphone somewhere.
Oh.
Okay, out there. There we go. We've got a funny blue microphone. I see some hands up. Maybe we could give that person, that brave person in the back.
Oh, what a fine-looking audience.
I'm sorry, wait, we can't hear you.
What? Hold it higher? Does that work? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'm not sure I'm precisely on point with respect to journalism, but you're a professor at the University of Virginia, which is now struggling with, as lots of institutions in the South, about their celebration of their founders, and there's a number of people at UVA who want to toss out Jefferson as the iconic leader and founder of the university. What do you think in terms of facing our past? What do you think about what's going on in universities around the country, and whether it's gone too far, not far enough? Your comments.
Yeah, sure. I don't think there are a lot of people at UVA who want to toss out Thomas Jefferson, and in part it's because he's so good to teach with. Thomas Jefferson embodies the American dilemma, right? So Thomas Jefferson wrote these words: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." He said that. He meant that in a way, and he provided a template for things that Americans hold really deeply. I mean, these are some of our most treasured values, and it's not a coincidence that Martin Luther King, quoted the Declaration of Independence so often in his own speeches because he wanted to hold America to that commitment. So that's part of what he left us with. He also left us with the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, and he left us with the University of Virginia. He left us with some really precious stuff. And he was a slave owner. And he was somebody whose wealth and whose status, his position in society, whose achievements depended on the labor of his slaves and the wealth that his slaves created. He was somebody who could never bring himself to let go of slavery. He condemned it, but he could never let go of slavery. He could never free his slaves except for those who were, his own children. He has both sides of America. He has, that side which cherishes freedom and liberty, and he also has that darker side of America which is about racial oppression. And when we talk about Thomas Jefferson, we get to talk about both of those things. He's an immensely complicated man.
So
but
what should UVA do?
embrace both sides.
Okay.
You know, teach both sides. Put that at the heart of what it is that we do. It's a complicated story, but we can't avoid it.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe we have time just for one more question, and then we will wrap up.
Okay.
I think we've got a hand up over here, or? We did? No?
Hi.
I know there is one right here.
Just start talking?
Okay.
Hi.
Oh,
Over
wow.
here.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
So you said that you felt like this was the culmination of something for National Geographic. Our country hasn't had a real honest reckoning about racism in our past, and I'm curious if you think this is the beginning of a more honest look at our history.
Well, there were really, two reasons we wanted to do this issue. One was April 4th was the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and it seemed like a good time to step back and take stock of where we are on race. But the other reason is, we're engaged in a pretty dreadful conversation in this country around all kind of racial issues, and racism is being used as a political wedge. Communities are still segregating. We're really struggling with inclusion. And I thought that this was a great opportunity, that using the fact-based, science-based voice of National Geographic, maybe we could help spark a reasoned conversation in a broad-based conversation. And I think we have had success in that. This material has been out for about 6 weeks now. More than 350 million people around the world have accessed our issue on race across our digital and social platforms.
Wow.
So I am very happy about that, and look, if we can do anything to help have a more reasoned conversation, we are all for it. Anyway, we unfortunately have to wrap this up. I know everybody's interested in the next speaker. Anyway, I want to thank you,
Thank you,
John,
Susan.
for
This was
everything you
fun.
did. Thank you
you.
all.